Politicians at the beginning of the 18th century were split between the Whigs and the Tories. To summarise this basic division, the Tories supported the old Stuart dynasty, while the Whigs supported the Hanoverians. And Walpole was a Whig, so he had support from King George I, the first Hanoverian king, and his successor King George II. Then, after the South Sea bubble crisis saw many politicians charged with corruption, he was left as the most influential member of Parliament and was named the First Lord of the Treasury, effectively the first Prime Minister. But as George I could speak no English and Walpole could speak no German, they had to communicate with each other in allegedly very bad Latin. Once in power, Walpole was able to secure an alliance with Austria in 1731, but largely focused on keeping Britain out of wars, like the Polish War of Succession in 1733. This allowed him to reduce the national debt after decades of war, and lower land taxes, appeasing the landed gentry who formed the bulk of his support. He also increased the power of Parliament and refused 10 Downing Street as a personal gift from the king. Instead, he made it the home of any First Lord of the Treasury, so it became the house of all of his successors and is still the home of Prime Ministers today. But new taxes on things like gin and the Licensing Act of 1737, which looked to censor what was being said in theatres, made him very unpopular, and he finally had to give in to the public demand for war with Spain, and the War of Jenkins' Ear began. But the War of Jenkins' Ear, which was fought in the Americas, was part of the larger War of Austrian Succession, and because he didn't pursue an aggressive campaign in Europe, he lost even more support. Plus, the War of Jenkins' Ear was initially conducted poorly, he was accused of corruption, and he fared poorly in the 1741 election against the Tories and opposition Whigs. So in 1742, a vote of no confidence forced him to resign. Spencer Compton was a former Speaker of the House who had some affiliation with the Whig opposition, so he was just seen to be a temporary compromise, with Earl Grenville and the Pelham brothers maintaining real power, but he died shortly after taking office. Henry was the younger of the Pelham brothers and served as Secretary of War, and he, along with his brother, quickly forced Grenville out of the ministry. Plus, as a Whig, he worked alongside the Tories in order to oust Walpole, but now in power he excluded the Tories from office, and this in part led to many Tories supporting the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, which was successfully put down. Plus, he also brought an end to the Austrian War of Succession, and now at peace, much like Walpole, he worked on reducing expenditure and the national debt. Otherwise, he adopted the Gregorian calendar and passed the Jew Bill, which allowed Jewish people to become naturalized. However, public outrage caused it to be repealed shortly afterwards. During his term in office, he kept an outright majority in the election of 1747, but he died in 1754 and was replaced by the Duke of Newcastle, Thomas Pelham, his older brother. Thomas Pelham had been Secretary of State for many years and was a supporter of the continued alliance with Austria, but many criticised him for not recognising the importance of the American colonies. And he took over just as the French-Indian Wars erupted in North America, and as Britain focused on the Americas, Austria formed an alliance with France. So he formed an alliance with Prussia, causing the diplomatic revolution just before the outbreak of the 7 Years' War. And his brother's handling over the country's finances put Britain at an advantage when this war began, but the war initially went very poorly. For instance, they lost Minorca in 1756, so he was forced to resign. Cavendish was brought in to replace him, but his cabinet was largely dominated by William Pitt the Elder, a Whig politician who was a prominent opponent of Walpole. But Cavendish didn't last long. He was accused of wrongfully having the admiral who lost Minorca executed, and King George II disliked Pitt and the new coalition, so he had Pitt dismissed, and this led to the breakdown of the cabinet for a while, until Pitt formed a coalition with Thomas Pelham. Pitt and Pelham, two previous rivals, successfully worked together during the 7 Years' War, despite their differences. Pelham, for instance, wanted to secure Corsica before attacking mainland Europe from the south, but Pitt wanted to fight out in the colonies, leaving Britain somewhat undefended. But they found a compromise, sending expeditions to Germany to tie down the French, and to the colonies. Then in 1759, the Year of Miracles, they achieved success in Canada, Senegal, India and more. They also sent large sums of money to their Prussian allies and kept Spain out of the war. But they were undermined by the new King George III. George III favoured a Tory, John Stuart, who, despite losing the election of 61, was asked to form a new government. John Stuart was a Scottishman and a Tory, and was very unpopular in England, but with the king's backing he was able to form a government and make peace. yet many saw him as being far too lenient on the defeated French. Plus, John Stuart also wanted to keep a strong military presence in the Americas. However, to pay for it, he introduced new taxes like the cider tax on the colonists, paving the way for the American Revolution. Then he even lost the support of the king, and he was satirised heavily by John Wilkes, an MP in the North Britain, so he resigned. The Whigs came back into power when Grenville formed a coalition, but he had to radically improve the nation's finances after the 7 Years' War and deal with Pontiac's rebellion in North America. One of the most infamous ways he sought to raise money was with the Stamp Act. This led to riots in the 13 colonies and again led to the American Revolution. Plus, he failed to make any real alliances, so when it did break out, Britain was left by itself. He too also tried to introduce new taxes, which was met with opposition, and he was dismissed by the king in 1765. Charles Watson-Wentworth, to appease the Americans, quickly went about repealing the Stamp Act, but didn't really resolve the ongoing issues in America, as he also passed the Declaratory Act. This gave Parliament the same authority in the colonies as in Britain, meaning all laws would apply across the territories equally. In Parliament, he formed an alliance of powerful MPs like Edmund Burke, Charles Fox, William Cavendish, and Thomas Pelham. But these, the Rockingham Whigs as they were called, were not numerous enough to stop his downfall, and his unpopularity forced him to resign. George III had long looked to end party distinctions, and often called on Pitt to form a government, and finally, after years of being one of the most prominent and powerful politicians, he accepted. He appointed people into the ministry from all parties, but one appointment, Charles Townshend as Chancellor of the Exchequer, proved to be controversial, as he passed a series of acts known as the Townshend Acts. Amongst other things, these put more taxes on the colonists, again further worsening the situation there. Plus, Pitt also angered a great deal of landowners, as he embargoed the export of corn to stop a shortage during a bad harvest before resigning due to ill health in 1768. FitzRoy had largely ran the cabinet while Pitt had been ill, so was his natural successor. He was, however, unable to turn around the growing problems in America, and he lost all support when France annexed the Republic of Corsica, and he had no response to it, so he resigned in 1770. Frederick North, his successor, was quickly challenged by the Spanish over control of the Falkland Islands. This was because both nations maintained settlements there, but unlike FitzRoy, North stood his ground and the Falklands crisis ended peacefully, and Britain remained on the islands. His Lord of the Admiralty, the Earl of Sandwich, who allegedly gave his name to the food, also paid for Captain Cook's expeditions to the South Pacific. Plus, he had very close connections with George III, but many saw this relationship as an issue and threatened to bring royal power back into Parliament. He also introduced the Tea Act, which led to the Boston Tea Party of 1773, and in response to that he tried to punish Boston through what were called the Intolerable Acts, but this just angered the colonists and the American Revolution broke out a couple years later. He too had also failed to gain a major ally since the 7 Years' War, so Britain was left fighting alone against Spain, France and the Netherlands when they joined in with the revolutionaries. Plus, he also stopped the ships of neutral countries, looking for French contraband. So Russia, Sweden, Denmark and the like signed the League of Armed Neutrality in order to oppose this. At home, he relaxed the laws on Catholics, especially Catholics serving in the military, but this had very little popular support, and the anti-Catholic Gordon riots swept across London. These riots of 1780 were so bad that the army had to be called in, and as the war turned against the British as they were defeated at Yorktown, there was a vote of no confidence and he resigned. Watson-Wentworth came back into power and quickly pushed through the Relief of the Poor Act in order to aid the growing unemployed. However, this inadvertently helped to establish the workhouses that would have people working in notoriously bad conditions, and he only served a couple of months before dying of influenza. Petty's appointment by the king angered many of the powerful politicians who resigned from their posts. This included Edmund Burke and Fox would go on to form an alliance with Lord North, providing strong opposition. However, their resignations allowed Petty to appoint William Pitt the Younger, who was only 23, as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Petty's term in office was largely dominated with making peace with the Americans, and many argued that he was overly generous by even granting them control over land beyond the Appalachians and in Illinois. But he believed a strong USA would become a major trading partner in the future, and he also managed to hold on to Canada. But the Fox-North coalition proved to be too strong, and he was forced to resign. Portland took over, but Fox and North had real power, and this was the first time that the king had very little say in who would hold office. George III in fact disliked Fox so much that he blamed him for the future King George IV's debauchery, and even considered abdicating. But this cabinet did not last long, as Fox tried to place the East India Company's land in India under control of Parliament. The king stepped in and threatened to brand any member of the House of Lords who voted in favour of this bill as an enemy of the crown. So the bill failed and Fox was dismissed, ending the coalition. The king asked Pitt the Younger to form a new government, but this brought about a bit of a constitutional crisis, as he didn't have a majority of support within Parliament. But an election in 1784 gave him this majority and the crisis was averted. Pitt ran as a Tory, but he really brought about new Toryism, breaking away from many of their old ideals and just being a broad umbrella of Whig opposition. And with his new majority he could go about enacting reforms. For instance, the war in America left the country in a great deal of debt, so he lowered tariffs to stop people smuggling in goods and paying no tariffs at all. Internationally he tried to stop the Russians from expanding too much, and even looked to go to war with them a couple of times, so he formed the Triple Alliance with Prussia and the Netherlands, but this proved to be ineffective as Russian diplomats worked closely with Pitt's opposition. In the Empire he reformed the East India Company by creating a board to oversee their activities and increasing the power of the Governor-General, who at the time was Cornwallis. This gave him more power over the separate governors of Madras and Bombay. In 1791 he split Quebec in two, dividing it along nationalities, giving the English Upper Canada and the French Lower Canada. But back in 1788 he was almost removed from power, as King George III was descending into madness and unable to continue his duties. His son, the future George IV, was set to rule as regent, and as an ally of Fox he would have removed Pitt from office. However, the regency crisis ended when George III regained mental capacity and Pitt was allowed to continue. Pitt also served when the French Revolution broke out, and to prevent the same from occurring in Britain, he introduced many oppressive reforms. For instance, anyone publishing seditious material was punished, the right to assemble was restricted, and habeas corpus was suspended. Otherwise, to improve the economy, he introduced the country's first ever income tax. Yet, when the Revolutionary Wars broke out, Britain had a very small standing army, and relied on the navy. So, as part of his new quota system, every region was expected to send a certain number of recruits to the navy. As part of the wars, he did send troops to Haiti during the slave revolt in order to undermine the French, but yellow fever killed thousands, the British army was crippled, and it cost millions. At home, the Society of United Irishmen rose up in the 1790s, but the Parliament in Dublin was unwilling to loosen any anti-Catholic laws, even though sectarian violence broke out across Ireland. While on the continent, France continued to be victorious, looked to aid the Irish rebels, and Britain was left fighting alone following their allies' defeats. So he saw Parliament in Dublin as inept, and pushed through the Acts of Union, which united Britain and Ireland in 1801. But to appease the new kingdom, he looked to grant concessions to Catholics, something the king refused to do, so he resigned.